Welcome to this event today. My name is Kahal Sharma, and I'm one of the 3 interfaith ministers in residence here at the Episcopal Diocese of Los Angeles. Thank you all so much for joining us for this really important conversation about white Christian nationalism. And more importantly, thank you all for giving us the chance to be able to bring different communities together, different congregations, different denominations, different faith traditions, to be able to talk about something that's very pertinent to our political world and our moral world right now. Just to start off the space today, I'd like to introduce Bishop John Taylor from the Episcopal Diocese of Los Angeles to open this space.
Yay! Thank you, Tom. Thank you all. First of all, an additional word of welcome on behalf of Bishops Boss and Swenson, my colleagues from the Lutheran and Methodist vineyards, as well as the somewhat ponderously titled but absolutely vital program group on Ecumenical and Interfaith Life. Our program group is chaired by an accomplished and innovative interfaith minister in Orange County. She's a former broadcast journalist from the greatly conflicted state of Texas. She's a dear friend of many years, Dot Leach, and I do not believe Dot is here, is she? She is not here. Dot has been struggling with some health issues and nevertheless providing amazing leadership from afar. So please keep her in your prayers. And I also send out thanks to her colleague in coordinating the work of the program group, Canon for Common Life, Bob Williams. And so I'd like to ask Bob, who is already standing, and the other members of the program group, please to stand so we can say thank you to all of you for today. Meeting the bishops and others in the course of the afternoon. In all of our work, which is dominated, as our church sometimes does tend to be dominated by baby boomer supremacy, we have been patiently guided for 6 years by 3 next stage experts on faith and justice in our region and in the United States. They've played a leadership role in planning this afternoon. You've just met one of them, but I'd like to ask all 3 of them to stand and be recognized. Sable Manson, Tasneem Noor, and Tahal Sharma. Thank you for their leadership, wisdom, and vision. Our absolutely wild idea of trying to land Dr. Cooper White for this already scheduled event received unexpected validation from the Holy Spirit thanks to a joyful family occasion that she and Michael had this week in Los Angeles, about which more later. But for now, please recognize and thank the Reverend Dr. Pamela Cooper White. Now, before I have the inestimable privilege of introducing her, our organizers have asked me to do my best to set the tone from a strictly religious perspective. From our keynoter's book, The Psychology of Christian Nationalism, from an incredibly helpful chapter she provided offering practical techniques for bridging our yawning cultural and political divide, 2 things in particular jumped out at me. The first is that, and perhaps you found this, there are some people right now that we just can't talk to. Has anyone encountered that in their life and their work, at the supermarket, even at church? That there's no way to find the magic words to liquefy the walls of unknowing that some people have built up brick by brick and podcast by podcast. At another conference somewhere this afternoon, someone may be saying the same thing about me because I have been brainwashed by years of reading the New York Times. I have a friend or 2 who actually would say that, and we can still be friends, but we have to stick to talking about music and movies and grandchildren, about which more in a moment. The other thing I most remember from that chapter was Dr. Cooper White's thoughtful advice about religious dialogue, which was, at least that it gets started, that it's good for Southern Baptists to talk to Southern Baptists, Roman Catholics to talk to Roman Catholics, and you get the idea of mainline denominational Christians to et cetera, et cetera. Now, we were a diverse and interfaith community this afternoon, but mainline denominations tend to want to create common ground settings like this one for conversations among spiritually inclined folks with shared values running in the direction of justice and equity, reparation, and all-inclusive love. And this indeed is the purpose of our program group and programs such as today. And a couple of months ago, as we discussed this program and its title, we made the decision to say white Christian nationalism instead of Christian nationalism. First of all, we felt we were on solid ground in the light of Dr. Cooper White's book. Catalyzed to write by Trump's attempted coup, she argues that on the 6th of January 2021, Christian nationalist and white supremacist expression became virtually indistinguishable. Right. And therefore race is playing its irreducible role in the dynamics of American Christianity. I voted aye on the title change for that reason, but for a selfish denominational reason as well. My siblings in faith, we are all of us observers from our unique perspectives of the American religious landscape, particularly the hills and the valleys and the byways that we tread in our particular traditions. And I pay a lot of attention to the Christians. About 210 million Americans identify as Protestant and Roman Catholics. Of this group, perhaps 4%, which is to say about 8 million, and this is an optimistic number. At most 4% are part of and are comfortable with polities that erect no bar on the basis of orientation and identification. Speaking with great love of my collaborators in the Roman Catholic Church, the Church of Rome is generations, we understand, from crossing the Rubicon on gender. And American evangelicalism, though slightly more diverse than it was a generation ago, as Dr. Cooper White wrote in her book, is still male-dominated and white-dominated. So as the arc of history bends toward justice, American Christianity in large part remains unbent, with the exception of a few enclaves graciously overseen by Brenda and Mary Ann and a few others of us, notwithstanding all the justice work that all of our denominations must continue to do to repair and to express hope to all across barriers of race and nation, orientation and identification. And yet the preponderance of pessimism about the future of the church seems to have settled on the shoulders of parish treasurers and rectors and pastors in charge and bishops in our tiny little denominations, as though we're the ones who are on the wrong side of history, the wrong side of God's loving heart. This isn't a sermon, I promise, so I'll spare you the quotations from Paul about the persecution and harassment awaiting those who testify truly about the good news of Jesus Christ, the good news of the love of God for all whom God has made. But lest we are tempted to give in to the pessimism, and it can be tough sometimes, we've all experienced it, please remember this. Without that precious 4%, Christianity in this country would tend ever more in the direction of white supremacy and male supremacy and heterosexual supremacy. And that is not what Jesus would have us do. What Jesus would have me do is introduce our keynote. Hers is a life story that is too rich to summarize well. It literally sings. Undergraduate and graduate studies in music and musicology, including her first PhD from Harvard. That all led her to music ministry in a church setting where she began to experience a call to ordained ministry deeply rooted in service in and around Boston to the food and housing insecure, as well as women and children at risk. The local angle for us Angelinos is that in the early Reagan years, she taught at UCLA, while volunteering at a Santa Monica shelter for victims of domestic abuse. Ordained in the United Church of Christ in 1994, she continued her music career, indeed her operatic career, in the Bay Area, as well as her service to refugees and battered women. See this story continuing to harmonize. Soon she took Episcopal orders, got her third master's degree in counseling, and there's a second PhD coming on top of all that. But her counseling master's supercharged her work on behalf of abused women and others at risk, including victims of clergy sexual abuse. And all that inspired her widely admired book, The Cry of Tomorrow. Then to Chicago for parish ministry and seminary teaching, and then to Lutheran Theological Seminary in Philadelphia for her first full-time professorship. Then on to Columbia as awards and recognitions accumulated, including a Fulbright Fellowship in Vienna. She now has finally just retired as Dean and Christiane Brooks Johnson Professor of Psychology and Religion at Union Theological Seminary. She remains emerita in both posts. The book we've been discussing in our diocese, thanks to the Reverend Canon Susan Russell, who is our own deft bridger of difference, is Dr. Cooper White's 10th in all. Her photography has been exhibited and published. She's still singing as a soprano soloist for the Gettysburg Chamber Orchestra, near where she and her spouse Michael, also ordained, also a dean, also amazing, live. And they're about to have a grandchild. My friends, Dr. Pamela Cooper White.
Glad to be with you. I love this diocese. I have an association with St. Albans from the time I taught at UCLA. And friends of mine at both All Saints, Pasadena and Beverly Hills, so I feel very much at home here. So let's begin. On January 6th, 2021, as we know all too well by now, a violent mob attacked the U.S. Capitol in a shocking effort to stop the certification of President Joe Biden as the next president of the United States. Deep in the midst of the mob was a loose-knit band of religiously motivated individuals who subscribed to this movement called Christian nationalism. On display among the crowds during the attack on the Capitol were numerous flags and signs with "Jesus saves" in bold letters and other Christian symbols proudly displayed, alongside a Confederate flag paraded through the halls of Congress. A photo that went viral showed a group of men before a, 8 or 9 foot cross, one with his forehead pressed against it in fervent prayer. One group in the mob called themselves a Jericho March, Christians blowing shofars. And as there's an interfaith sponsorship of this, let's just ponder the problems with that. And praying to bring down the walls of government. So those of us who were not caught up in the violence on January 6th, nor the underlying beliefs that fueled it, still wonder, how can people, even those we consider good people, get so caught up in a web of lies? How can Christians who believe in Jesus' Abba, God of love, mercy, justice, and truth, participate in such a movement fueled by white supremacy, masculinism, and even far-fetched conspiracy theories, while ignoring or even condoning its propensity to violence? How can people become convinced of such false, even delusional beliefs? How might it be possible to talk with people who've gone down the rabbit hole of brainwashing and irrational groupthink? Can dialogue draw them back out? If so, how? Is it ever possible to talk sense into someone who's come to believe dangerous untruths that, if not addressed, can harm us all? When, how, and in what context might dialogue be fruitful? And when does it simply raise the other person's closely guarded defenses and reinforce polarization? Trump and his close imitators' appeal goes far beyond certain conservative policies against abortion, immigration, welfare, gender justice, and racial equity, which are congruent with the convictions of a broad swath of Christians often called evangelical. But Trump tapped into a deep and broad reservoir of resentment and paranoia that has actually been accumulating for decades. A large pool of Christians who feel they're being persecuted and called by God to rise up and defend themselves against their enemies. And not only must they regain equal footing with others in society, many believe, but they must dominate and be in control, and all this in the blessed name of Jesus. A common belief among Christian nationalists is that there has been a woeful decline of America's standing in the world because of the nation's growing degeneracy, as they see it, and with it, the concomitant belief in an urgent call to restore the nation to its original goodness and a mandate to lead the world in godliness. Therefore, God has withdrawn his blessing from America because supposedly, like the ancient Israelites, she, and I'm using these pronouns deliberately, has fallen into profligacy and a violation of God's law. The United States was founded, according to this group, by evangelical Christians, based on a misreading of the more complex history of the framers of the Constitution, and had God's special mandate to become a new Jerusalem in which white Christians, mostly male, will rule over a nation whose laws are perfectly aligned with their own selective fundamentalist reading of biblical mandates. Theologically, an extreme version of Calvinism called dominionism and a radical subset called Reconstructionism trickled down into evangelical Protestantism without most churchgoers even realizing the origins of this shift to a post-millennial apocalyptic message. A similar movement called integralism has been gaining traction in the Catholic churches to integrate the state under the ultimate spiritual authority of the church. In my research, I found that Christian nationalist preachers tend to leap across the Bible from what they call the Old Testament to the book of Revelation, the last book of the New Testament, making scant reference, if at all, to the teachings of Jesus about love, healing, and justice. They jump from a highly selective reading of the Hebrew Bible that they believe supports the idea of a wrathful God directly to the second coming of Jesus in the end of days. In their interpretation of apocalyptic scripture, many see an avenging Jesus coming to wage spiritual warfare against the current decadent ways of America and the world. Those who hold such views see a growing depravity of the current age as evidence that the time is near, and it is their duty to help bring it about. Christian nationalist preachers exhort the faithful in sermons and song to, quote, take this nation back, even by force if required. I believe we're at a pivotal moment in the American experiment of democracy and also in the very character of American Christianity. As my research for my book, The Psychology of Christian Nationalism, demonstrates, the term Christian nationalism really means white nationalism. The main tenets of Christian nationalism are that God established the United States as a Christian nation and therefore should essentially be a theonomy, a governance of laws, shaped by ultra-conservative Christian values, and a theocracy, a government, characterized by the headship of men over their households and white male leadership in the public square. Christian nationalists therefore oppose the separation of church and state, rather advocating for the display of Christian symbols in public spaces and explicitly Christian prayer in schools and civic gatherings. Now, I do want to make a very important distinction right here, and that is that Black church Protestants also align Christian values with politics. as do many in this room. All Saints Pasadena has a long history of that. But aligning to gospel-grounded social and political action for change, whereas white Christian nationalist agenda is almost entirely opposed to what we would consider social justice, and stands opposed to virtually everything taught in Christianity or Judaism about justice and compassion. Christian nationalists oppose religious pluralism and oppose generous immigration policies to keep out those infamous drug dealers and rapists, as Trump said, and to keep out Muslims and other non-Christians. They oppose abortion without exception, even in cases of rape or incest. They oppose expanding the rights of women and LGBTQ persons, with a recent rise in attacks on trans persons. And in a long chain of history, beginning with the utterly denied genocidal founding of this nation, yes, you heard me right, they oppose civil rights legislation and embrace laws that perpetuate structural and institutional racism. Anti-Semitic attacks have been on the rise ever since Trump's first term as president, as some extremists chant the Nazi slogan, "Jews will not replace us." Some Christian nationalists also believe that eco-justice and addressing climate change is moot because the apocalypse is coming and this earth will be destroyed anyway. Let me be clear then. Christian nationalism is a fanatical, radical departure from the teachings of Jesus and any faithful reading of either the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament, and it is also dangerously anti-democratic. Christians, both mainline or liberal and evangelical, have begun to sound the alarm from within the church about the dangers of Christian nationalism and its corrosive effects on both the nation and on American Christianity itself. Most notably now, I do want to give a shout out to the organization called Christians Against Christian Nationalism, which was founded by a Baptist Central Committee wanting to make a public statement that you cannot paint all Christians, even evangelical Christians, with the same brush and assume that all Christians are now Christian nationalists. They do wonderful educational work. Lest we conclude that Christian nationalism is a fringe movement involving only a small percentage of American Christians, and Bishop John kind of alluded to that in his introduction, some recent statistics show that as many as 2/3 of all American Christians taken together, according to the latest Baylor religion study, agree with at least some elements of Christian nationalism. And that does include members of mainline churches. A slightly older study with statistics from 2017 said that 50% of mainline church attenders agree with some elements of Christian nationalism. So we are not off the hook. The most recent set of survey questions posed by the PRRI Brookings Institute indicated that close to 1/3 of Americans, a smaller but still non-trivial percent, 33% or 30%, agree wholly, 10%, that's the pink, or are in sympathy, 19%, with the following statement. So taken together, it's about 1/3 of the slice of the pie. So maybe there is some improvement, but I actually think that part of the reason that the statistics have gone down is because they used more pointed questions that were a little less vague and a little more pointed toward the actual beliefs of Christian nationalists. So these are their statements that they asked survey participants to agree with or not. The U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation, should declare it. U.S. laws should be based on Christian values. If the U.S. moves away from our Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore. Being Christian is an important part of being truly American, and God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. So close to 1/3 of Americans agree with these statements. I'm letting you absorb that for a sec. regarding the statement that God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society, in a separate 2023 study, found that Christian nationalists believe in a 7-mountain mandate. Have any of you ever heard of this? You said yes. I had not, but that shows kind of the bubble we live in. It was popularized by Campus Crusade and Youth with a Mission, which claims that Christians should have dominion over 7 arenas of life: home, religion, schools, business, media, entertainment, and government. So what's left? And this particular survey as you see, the more that people agree with Christian nationalism, the more they agree with the 7-mountain mandate. In another recent study, 60% of adherents and 37% of sympathizers agree with the statement that non-Christians create immoral policies. This is 2022. Non-Christians create immoral policies. So who are Christian nationalists? I don't even like to really use that term because it sounds like it so solidifies a group that is quite complex and diverse. But let's say Christian nationalist-leaning people, especially adherents, are concentrated primarily in the South and in rural areas, with pockets in the West and in the upper Midwest, where sympathizers also tend to live in rural areas and in towns. Over 3/4 are white evangelical Protestants, and within evangelical Protestantism, 80 to 84% agree. So that is religiously where the largest percentage of agreement still resides. Conservative-leaning Catholics also make up a significant percent, especially in the Midwest. That's about 1 in 5. Lower formal education tends to correlate with the degree of agreement with Christian nationalist beliefs, and on average, Christian nationalists are older than the general population, averaging mid-50s. Women represent just slightly more than half of those who agree, so there's no real gender divide there. 94% of hardcore adherents, quote, overwhelmingly believe in God without any doubts at all and hold the Bible in high esteem. That's from a sociological study, which is twice the number of those who mostly resist Christian nationalism and 7 times greater than those who reject it completely. A vast publishing empire and online Christian family content, such as James Dobson's decades-old Focus on the Family, also promotes Christian nationalist ideas as part of its campaign to promote the traditional patriarchal family and to indoctrinate children into a melding of religion, right-wing patriotism, and a conservative, God-honoring definition of Christian family life. And part of that is also encouraging and providing resources for homeschooling. Right-wing Christian church services, are awash in patriotic symbols and songs, and public political rallies are now awash in evangelical prayer and so-called Christian praise music. So if you were just to take a glance at these 3 photos, it would be hard to tell which was a church service and which was a political rally. Michael Flynn, who you may remember was pardoned by Trump for lying to the FBI, just a federal crime, is now leading a national reawakening tour to recruit an army of God, blending alt-right politics, Christian rhetoric, and QAnon conspiracy theory at somewhere between $250 and $500 a ticket, and even offering baptisms in big metal tubs. Now, this movement did not just arrive. I know, I had to throw it in there somewhere. This movement did not just arrive on the scene around the time of Trump's first presidential campaign. The current wave goes back at least as far as the Reagan era. I say the current wave. And we had in the 1980s such figures as Pat Robertson. It was part of a general white conservative backlash to the civil rights movement in the 1960s and a continuation of the white supremacy, Christian nationalism, and nostalgia for the lost cause of the Confederacy that all converged in the KKK. But it's also prefigured and has continued to wax and wane over time as part of a larger recurrence of revivalist movements led by charismatic white evangelicals throughout American history. Confederates were not the first to use biblical texts to justify the genocide of Native Americans, chattel slavery, and the subordination of women under the guise of protecting the so-called weaker sex. Christian nationalism in the form of dominionism, further, has not been confined just to religious settings, but leaders of the movement have long been planning how to implement this seven-mountain mandate, and historians such as Robert Jones have documented the many covert coalitions with other right-wing political operatives over many decades. A scholar of Reconstructionism, Julie Ingersoll, has stated, "The niceties of democracy fall by the wayside when you are on God's side fighting Satan." So, for example, how this gets concrete. Several Christian-identified law schools' curricula were explicitly designed to send out an ever-increasing cadre of graduates to strengthen the influence of conservative Christian beliefs on the practice of law, the judiciary, and the national government. A secretive Christian right legislative campaign called Project Blitz, sponsored by the Congressional Prayer Caucus and other right-wing Christian groups since 2017, has pushed its model bills through state legislatures and has an annual playbook for dominionist legislative strategy. A recent New York Times article exposed how wealthy alt-right activists like the Wrights, the owners of Hobby Lobby, and Christian nationalist pastors strategically gained access and influence with Justice Alito and Supreme Court staff. And we're also just now seeing more and more revelations about the ties that Clarence Thomas also has. So I hardly need to say to this group, we're now seeing the fruits of this strategic infiltration at every level of government, from local school boards to state legislatures to the decades-long campaign to pack the Supreme Court with anti-abortion, anti-LGBTQ, and as we've just seen, anti-affirmative action, conservative activist judges. So how do we understand this movement, which now has purchase not only in religious, but in civic and private domestic life? So in my research, I've focused on the psychology of the movement, namely why and how do people get hooked on Christian nationalism and related conspiracy theories. I utilize both sociological and psychoanalytic lenses to explore the psychology behind people's vulnerability to being captivated by false teachings, both religious and political, and their personal investment in maintaining these beliefs. So first, from a more sociological perspective, I've identified at least 4 conscious motivations behind adherence to Christian nationalist ideas. First, belonging and purpose. Evangelism, very aggressive evangelism often, fulfills the need for belonging and a sense of purpose for one's life, heightened by the religious appeal to join in a cosmic battle of good and evil, with tactics that are similar and at times nearly identical with cult recruiting. If you want to see more details on that, you can look in my book. Secondly, fear. There's a couple of you see how we're moving from belonging to fear to paranoia here. Fear of the loss of white social status and a desire to maintain white supremacy. Resentment against a perceived, though still quite minimal statistically, loss of jobs and economic power to immigrants and people of color, and a desire to maintain or regain white dignity and white power in the face of reality, and this is a reality, that according to the U.S. Census Bureau, the year 2042 will mark the end of a white majority population in the United States. Now, while many of us would celebrate that and think that diversity is a wonderful thing, for these folks, it feels like a threat. Fear also of loss of patriarchal authority and a masculinist hierarchy both in the home and in the public sphere of work and governmental power, which also is related to an infatuation with guns that far exceed any need for hunting or for personal protection. And I'll come back to guns in a moment. And then finally, paranoia, the irrational allure of conspiracy theories such as QAnon, whose beliefs are now adopted by as many as 1 in 5 Americans overall. Yeah, and 1/4 of evangelical Christians. You see the merger of God wins with where we go one, we go all, which is a QAnon motto. This was at January 6th. Now, these 4 motivations are made explicit by individuals to varying degrees. They wouldn't necessarily put it in the language I'm using here, but they're conscious to the degree that people who believe in Christian nationalism would agree with them, even if they use different language to describe them. Turning toward unconscious motivations, these involve the insidious subliminal pulls from unconscious group dynamics. And this goes all the way back to Sigmund Freud's prescient analysis of groups in 1921, and parallels between Christian nationalism and the power of cult-like groups and their narcissistic leaders to make and amplify false claims, including the role of both mainstream and social media. The power of group persuasion was long known by psychologists throughout history. I believe Freud's group psychology is as relevant a description today as it was in his own time regarding the psychologically symbiotic bond between followers and their idealized leaders. Freud's breakthrough in 1921, right on the heels of World War I, was to recognize the power of a narcissistic leader and the ways in which followers unconsciously hand over their individual consciences, superego, ego ideal, to a demagogue who, with simplistic moral directives and all good versus evil political rhetoric, promises to restore whatever they perceive is lacking in their lives. And Trump recently said at a rally, "I'm your redeemer and your retribution." Such leaders exude a fusion of power and erotic potency that men can merge with at an unconscious psychic level, and women can admire, even desire. Maybe not you, but we're talking unconscious here too. Okay, so how relevant is this, though, to the right-wing strongmen leaders like Trump and the bloody dictators across the globe he still emulates and praises, as in his praise for Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which was amplified by a shockingly large number of evangelical Christians. This also ties in with the symbolic value of guns and a defensive hyper-masculinity, and the extraordinary prevalence of guns in the United States. My spouse, Michael, was just at a vigil for the mass shooting victims in Fort Worth, Texas, but you can put a pin in almost every state and every major city for mass shootings. The number of mass shootings in the United States right now outnumbers the number of days in the entire year. And a preoccupation with guns is shared by a majority of white evangelical Christians. This picture on the left was taken at a Black Lives Matter rally that Michael and I attended in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. They had come over to Gettysburg to protect the Confederate monuments on July 4th, which actually there was no credible threat to them, and then hung around for the Sunday when we had this march, and they just hung around as threatening presences. And if you look at the little boy in the middle there, I mean, my heart just goes out to him. He was looking admiringly up at these two guys, intimidating guys. So the tie-in with white evangelical Christians is that they own the most guns of any religious group in the United States. Nearly half of evangelical Christians are gun owners. And they fuse the Second Amendment right to bear arms with a skewed religious fervor for personal freedom. As the Outback restaurant motto has it, no rules, just rights. And yes, beginning with Sarah Palin's appearance on the national political scene, women have also begun to emulate this muscular, masculine style. I gotta bring him in somewhere. Love, said Freud, puts a check on narcissism, and as such is crucial to civilization. But narcissistic leaders love only themselves and exploit the love and devotion of their followers only and always for their own benefit, as they see it, according to their whims. A high conformity group with a highly manipulative leader can exploit individuals who feel wounded, whether by repressed childhood traumas or by envy, economic fears, and group resentments, or by a changing societal landscape that threatens one's cherished notions of tradition and even identity. Narcissistic leaders thrive on amplifying perceived threats and providing simplistic solutions. Appeals to nostalgia for a better earlier time, usually fictional and usually benefiting only one ethnic group, can be wrapped in nationalism as patriotism rather than pure ethnocentrism. So Trump's motto, "Make America Great Again," made this strong appeal to a glorious past that never was glorious for scores of women, persons of color, and Native Americans. And the narcissistic leader can heighten this appeal by framing it all in terms of a religious cause. Such religious appeals invoke a battle of good versus evil in which fear is mobilized to hate. Take a breath. So taking all of this into consideration, how can we talk across the extreme religious and political divide that has emerged from these trends in white right-wing Christian nationalism? Is it even possible? And if so, how? And if not, what do we do instead? The purpose of this part of my book, as in the subtitle, is by no means to create a false peace forged by mainstream appeals to unity, which gloss over the deadly realities of racism and other forms of oppression and silence movements for justice and social change. So not, as the Hebrew prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel both warned, crying, "Peace, peace," where there is no peace. The powers of backlash, of white supremacy and patriarchy depend on lies in order to keep unjust systems in place. So this goes to the heart of that question: how can I talk across the rift that's happened in my family, my church, my community, because we've come to believe diametrically opposite ideas about faith, health, the economy, climate change, politics? And after spending some time immersed in Christian nationalist settings for my research, I came to agree with the assessment of many that die-hard Christian nationalists truly live in an alternate reality. So is honest, open conversation really possible? Several psychologists who have studied this phenomenon have stated that once people have gone down the rabbit hole of misinformation and conspiracy theories, there can be no convincing them of the truth. Well, I disagree. As a therapist, I believe in talk under the right conditions. Rather than throwing in the towel, I recommend a triage approach to discern if and when fruitful conversation might be possible and when it should not be attempted. As psychologist Bandy Lee has recommended, when dialogue is not possible, engagement in education and activism are the best ways to channel our own frustration and outrage. But when it comes to a firmly entrenched Christian nationalist, we have to remember that we're trying to talk not only with an individual, but we're trying to dialogue with their favorite news network, an ever self-reinforcing bubble of opinion fed to them on social media through algorithms sifting through their clicks and likes, and the hundreds or even thousands of members of their church where they just praised Jesus and asked him to save the United States while listening to heart-thumping rock music and indoctrinating sermons. We're trying to dialogue with QAnon. So argumentation will not work, period. Give it up. We do need to walk away whenever we perceive that to continue in such a one-sided dialogue will either violate our own sense of personal integrity, continuing to engage with what we consider to be outright hate speech, or causing harm to ourselves because we're being subjected to verbal violence, or even worse. When fruitful conversation may be possible, then, how do we put a toe in the water? First, we have to ask ourselves, am I the right person to be having this conversation? Is this the right time? And is this the right place? The Thanksgiving table, where lots of wine has been flowing freely, is probably not the right place or time. And as Bishop John alluded to before, maybe someone who has been inside the movement and has extricated themselves or taken some steps toward distance would be a better conversation for someone who is in the movement than someone who they already perceive to be just a bleeding liberal. If the answer to the question is, am I the right person to be having this conversation, right time, right place, is yes, maybe, then maybe there is a yellow light. Proceed with caution. When we sense some openness, as in the case of what I call a soft Christian nationalist who is not completely convinced by right-wing rhetoric, and where mutual liking and trust perhaps are already established. For example, with a coworker, a friend, a skeptical family member, a neighbor, or a friendly acquaintance. And the only way into such a conversation is to show respect and to listen. Not to pounce on an error in their thinking or immediately try to enlighten or heal them. I mean, who would like that? But try to understand with as much empathy as we can muster what it must be like to be this person and to inhabit their life with its various challenges and stresses. Empathy is not the same thing as sympathy. It is being able to step into the other's shoes, at least to some meaningful degree, to understand where they're coming from, but it does not have to mean agreement. A green light is still always tentative when it appears that there is some real openness to re-examine convictions, but remember, it can turn yellow or even red at a moment's notice. And yeah, I loved the image I found was left turn, yield on green. So I've outlined a whole detailed list of recommendations of how to talk, which basically is what you learn when I teach pastoral listening or when I teach counseling listening. And I'm not going to go through all of them right now, but there are many. But first and foremost is building and maintaining relationship always has to come first by finding common ground, including shared values, which I always want to assume that there are some shared values that we might have together. And practicing respect and kindness. Much of what I advocate is being non-directive, making I statements, keeping the truth that I own, that's my truth, not necessarily your truth, and following longtime anti-racist feminist activist Loretta Ross, assuming goodwill unless proven otherwise, and when confronting, engaging in a process she calls calling in, rather than publicly and self-righteously calling out the person who has said or done something we find offensive. She reserves calling out for addressing larger systems. She calls it calling up the abuses of institutions and structures of power. Being willing to listen and speak about the whole truth of what's happening in America today is finally a form of combating psychological splitting. Recognizing and resisting the very human unconscious temptation to split everything in a Manichaean cosmic battle of good and evil, which is what conspiracy theorists thrive on. This requires stamina. It takes courage to consciously weigh the good and bad of a relationship and hold them together, regarding them with both mercy and justice. And violence, whether physical or verbal, is never acceptable. But dialogue always has at least the potential, I want to believe, to be constructive. So finally, one thing honest dialogue also requires is to do our own inner work of healing the split between our own desired purity and the mostly disavowed evil within ourselves, to withdraw our worst projections that we've placed on another person, demonizing them, before we can enter into genuine dialogue. This is tricky because Christian nationalism, white supremacy, misogyny, and anti-LGBTQ hatred are truly reprehensible. That's not just our fantasy or our neurotic projection. But if we can hold the badness of a conversation partner's beliefs together with a belief in the potential for basic human goodness, that we are made in the image and likeness of God, then we not only may have the chance to exercise the skill of empathic listening, we may also finally be heard. Thank you very much.